It was Christmas Eve. Old Santa was just ready to start out upon a long journey over the snowy treetops and the roofs to find the waiting chimneys and the little empty stockings. Such a busy day as it had been, with the elves finishing and packing, and Mrs. Claus sewing on buttons on the last doll's dress, and tying the last hair ribbon, smoothing the last curl. Everything was ready. The sleigh was packed from top to bottom, so full it seemed as if old Santa could never even squeeze in. There were tops and drums and jack-in-the-boxes, steam engines, and hundreds of dolls and barrels of chocolate drops. Peppermint canes were hanging out from the back. The reindeer were harnessed and prancing, Dasher and Dancer and Donder and Vixen and the rest. The sleigh bells were ringing happily, and old Santa jumped in and took the reins. "Goodbye, Mother," I called to Mrs. Santa Claus, who stood in the door to watch the sleigh start. "Anything I can bring you from the city, dear?" "I think I need a new pair of spectacles," said Mrs. Claus. "My eyes are growing dim with so much sewing. If the stores are open when you're finished, just pick me up a new pair of spectacles, please." "I will. Goodbye," I shouted. With a dash and a jingle of bells, the reindeer jumped to the top of the trees and started, and Mrs. Claus went in to sit in a rocking chair and doze by the fire. The workshop was very still. Christmas Eve, you know, is the only time of the whole year when Santa's workmen rest. So the little elves who paint the sleds and nail the dollhouses and test the steamboats were all curled up in heaps on all the benches, fast asleep and snoring. The candy kettles were polished and hung in a row upon the kitchen wall. Mrs. Claus sat and rocked by the fire and thought of all the dolls she had dressed. There were 400 with silk dresses, she said to herself, and 200 with blue. There were 500 baby dolls, and I never finished dressing them until today. I wonder if Santa packed them all. I must go and see, she said. So Mrs. Claus lit a candle and went out to the sewing room and peered about in every corner. There were piles of silk and velvet and satin and ribbon all over the floor. But oh, there sat 3 dolls, a baby doll, a doll in pink, and a doll in blue. I had forgotten them. "What shall I do? What shall I do?" cried Mrs. Claus, looking out of the window to see if I was anywhere in sight. But I was not. We counted them all, and there were just enough to go around. 3 little girls will have no dolls on Christmas morning. I shall have to go with them myself. Out in the barn, there was just one reindeer standing in his stall. It was Blitzen, who had a lame foot, so he could not make the long journey with Santa this year. He was contentedly munching hay, but Mrs. Claus tucked the dolls under her arm, put on her little red shawl, tied her cap strings tighter, and hurried out to the barn. "Come, Blitzen," she said, as she saddled him and jumped on his back. "We must go as fast as ever after Santa Claus. He has left 3 dolls behind." So Blitzen dropped his hay and they started. Over the woods and the fields and the fences they dashed, so fast that the wind was left far behind. They looked very funny indeed, for Mrs. Claus had forgotten to take off her apron, and her cap was all awry, but on they hurried. When they came to the towns, Blitzen stopped at every roof that Mrs. Claus might look down the chimney. But Santa had always been there first, and the stockings were filled, and the dolls were waiting. "We counted them all," she kept saying to herself. "Someone will need a doll." And sure enough, she came to a very wee chimney of a very wee house, and there was a stocking hung, but there was only an apple in it, nothing else. So Mrs. Claus dropped the beautiful doll that was dressed in pink silk into the stocking and started on once more. Then they came to another house, and when Mrs. Claus looked down the chimney, she saw no stocking at all hanging by the fireplace, and there was not even a fire. There was nothing in the room but a table and a broken chair and a bed where a little girl so thin and pale lay sleeping. Mrs. Claus dropped the doll in the blue silk dress right down into the little girl's arms and hurried on again. When they had come to the end of the town, Mrs. Claus saw a little girl standing out in the street. She had a bundle of papers to sell, but no one had seen her because she was so small, and she was waiting out in the cold and snow. Mrs. Claus dropped the baby doll down to the little girl's lap and then turned blitzing towards home again. It was almost Christmas morning when they reached the barn, and oh, they were very tired. When I came back with my empty sleigh and the new spectacles, I found Mrs. Claus fast asleep in her rocking chair by the fire. Poor mother, she's been sewing so much. Just then Mrs. Claus awoke, but she never told about the 3 dolls.